Welcome to the Key Concepts video for Philosophy of Psychology Week 3. And this week we're looking at Stoicism and Buddhism on the soul. And we're looking at the readings by Alensky called Buddhist Psychology, and the reading by Brad Inwood, Walking and Talking, Reflections on Divisions of the Soul in Stoicism. So you should have completed those readings before you look at the key concepts video, I think is the best way to do it. So you'll already have some sense of what's in those readings when you look at the lecture content that I'm going to give you in this video. So we're looking at two more ancient theories of the soul. This week we're going to look at Stoicism and Buddhism and how they both sort of conceive things in the wake of the theories we looked at last week, the theories by Plato and Aristotle. Stoicism was influenced to some extent by those theories and takes its own kind of tack, different to both of them, in fact. Buddhism is an Eastern philosophy, and it'd be interesting for us to have a look at the ideas that come out of a different tradition and how they thought about the soul and some of the things that kind of that come up as relevant to the investigation in the Buddhist tradition. So we're going to take a look at both of these ideas in this lecture and in the course this week. So starting with Stoicism, we can see there's approximately sort of 500 years between the beginnings of Stoicism with Zeno and its sort of decline after Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor and the last really sort of famous, well-known Stoic writer. So there's a kind of Greek period, the early days with Zeno and Chrysippus. Chrysippus, who was probably the main kind of theorist of Stoicism, and we'll talk a little bit about him in the reading this week. And then from sort of 100 onwards, we find a lot of Roman Stoics and Seneca, and subsequently Marcus Aurelius, two of the most well-known Roman Stoics. A lot of the works of Stoicism didn't survive. We don't have original works by Zeno or Chrysippus, and most of the Greek figures that were around in the early days. Some of the information we have on them comes from later Roman writers who did have access to the texts, which have subsequently been lost. So there's a lot of interpretation and a lot of kind of cross-interpretation in trying to understand the Stoics. So we're going to try and take a close look at the Stoic theory of the soul and try and get a sense of how it kind of differs from the Aristotelian and the Platonist accounts that we looked at last week. All right, so starting with the sort of basic elements of Stoic physics. And the Stoics were believed very firmly in the material nature of the soul, that the soul is a material substance. So that's the only kind of thing that exists for Stoics. So the soul is not a kind of immaterial substance, as it could be argued it is in Plato, and as we'll see next week, that's also the sort of modern approach taken by Descartes. For the Stoics, the soul is of a material nature, and in fact everything is made of these four elements: fire, air, earth, and water, in specific combinations. And most centrally, we get sort of two substances, one that's made by the combination of fire and air, and that's pneuma. This is a sort of a word that means breath. Originally, it's sort of, we have it in words today like pneumatic, which is sort of, blowing up a tire and stuff like that. So reference to sort of, pumping air into something. So pneuma is the kind of is the most important substance. It's like a divine substance for the Stoics, but it's not immaterial. It's actually a combination of fire and air. But it's crucial to the soul and the different sort of divisions in the soul. earth and water, the other two elements, they sort of come together to make up matter, which is the other side of things. So what we find throughout the universe, according to the Stoics, is that pneuma is a kind of soul substance that's bound up with matter in different forms. So this is kind of a broad sort of idea of soul. It's almost like thinking of a world soul, where the soul sort of pervades and sort of goes through everything, sort of matter and all living things, all substances and so on. So for the Stoics, they have this kind of this broad view of the soul. We'll look at the sort of narrow view of the human soul in a minute, but they have this broad view of the soul as a substance in its own right, going by the name of pneuma, that's bound up with matter in various forms. And it's pneuma that gives the kind of consistency to matter, which would otherwise be a kind of formless, sort of just blob of stuff. So pneuma gives consistency and hardness and everything else, all the sort of qualities to matter, when it sort of informs it and gives it structure. So that's sort of the basic idea. And it's the interplay of those two elements, the sort of forming work of pneuma on matter, that sort of creates the different forms of matter and the different types of soul. So with that idea of kind of this sort of soul of the universe, there's this idea of this sort of Stoic great chain of being, right? Where everything in the universe is a combination of pneuma, which is like soul stuff, and matter. So pneuma is it's like the breath of life that's sort of breathed into matter, that sort of makes it, gives it its structure, gives it its consistency. It's like the kind of active principle, whereas matter is a kind of passive principle that receives pneuma and is formed by it. So this is kind of the general meaning, like I said, the broad meaning of the soul in Stoicism, right? There's this idea that the universe itself is made up of this kind of soul stuff, which we saw as a combination of fire and air, this pneuma, and the way it interacts with matter. So the human soul specifically is a specific form of this general world soul. So the human soul has a specific combination of pneuma and matter. So this tells us a lot about the harmony that Stoics saw throughout the universe. And this is crucial to their kind of broader philosophy of life. Everything is made of the same stuff and contains soul or divine elements. Everything in the universe contains those sort of soul elements. It contains pneuma because that's what gives it structure. That's what gives it the sort of principles that make it what it is. And that's sort of the way everything works. So there's a kind of, the whole sort of universe is pervaded by soul. So pneuma adds what the Stoics call tonos, and that's a kind of cohesion or tensional movement through the body or through the matter it is part of. And different types of physical organisms, so again, we saw with Aristotle, we distinguish plants and animals and human beings and sort of matter or physical substances in general. And we'll see similar distinctions in Stoicism, and that's accounted for in terms of different types of pneuma. So it's the different types of physical organism will have different types of tonos, different types of cohesion or tensional movement caused by the way that pneuma is structured in them, caused by the type of pneuma, whether it's kind of rarefied and how rarefied it is, that sort of pervades that sort of physical organ. So for the Stoics, everything in the universe is ordered into four different types of tension, four different types of tonos or tension, characterized by different types of pneuma in its relation to matter. And we can see the four sort of parts here, from hexis, which is the word for the type of coherence or tension in matter, a stone, a piece of wood, so something that's sort of not living or no longer living, but is a sort of piece of what we might call dead matter. For the Stoics, it's pervaded by soul, that gives it a kind of coherence or tension, makes it hard, gives it its properties. And then we have physis, which is the Greek word for nature, in fact. And this is the word for the coherence of things that grow, so typically plants. But the body's nutritive powers are also part of physis, so the way our bodies grow, the way they sort of digest food, and all that is part of the sort of physis, the idea of natural growth. But they're not specifically, so here those things are not specifically part of the human soul as in Aristotle. We saw in Aristotle that nutrition is sort of one of the key features of the human soul. Here they're part of physis, so they're part of the sort of plant soul, and they occur in humans, but they're not specifically part of the human soul for the Stoics. The distinctive functions of animal life are characterized by psyche, a word we encountered last week, which is the kind of meaning for soul. That's the word that means soul in ancient Greek. And the distinctive functions of animal life of psyche are sentience, so awareness, perception, and locomotion or movement. So it's psyche that gives the coherence or tensional movement to animals, that sort of allows them the kind of awareness, the capabilities of perception and movement towards what's perceived that we see as typical of animal behavior. So logos, the final one, is characteristic of the human soul. So that the human soul is rational and possesses logos, and that's sort of what makes it unique among the other forms of soul, that it has this sort of rational structure. So there's a hierarchy of capacities here, similar to Aristotle's scheme. And we might think of these as parts of a soul, of a material part, a nutritive growth part, physis, an animal part, which is psyche, of course, and a rational part, which is logos. And we might sort of think of sort of parts here as these different capacities and how they kind of stack up and build on one another, similar to, again, as we saw in Aristotle's. So we can see that sort of kind of hierarchy here. However, there are other ways of dividing the soul in Stoicism, as we'll see next. An important element here is what Stoics call the hegemonikon, which literally means the leading part of the soul, and the Stoics located that in the heart. And the idea is that it's the hegemonikon that kind of has these sort of connections through pneuma to all these different capacities. And there are 7 capacities here. As you'll have read already in the text by Inwood about the discussion about whether walking is a capacity. So if we don't take walking to be a distinct capacity, if we think that's just an example of sort of rational action and movement, then we've got these 7 parts. We've got taste, vision, hearing, smell, voice, touch, and reproduction. So we've got sort of the senses here, and the sort of capacity of human reproduction, which is considered part of the soul for the Stoics. So everything sort of is filtered through the hegemonikon, right? The hegemonikon sort of has its sort of its trails of pneuma going out to these different senses, and the senses report back to the hegemonikon, and it's the hegemonikon that has the sort of distinct powers to process all of these different kind of senses. So this gives us a sort of picture of the way, another way that Stoics sort of divided the soul. Here it's the division of the human soul into these kind of parts, with the sort of hegemonikon being the kind of ruler here of the soul, and sort of making decisions based on what it receives from the other parts. So there's a number of powers or parts within the hegemonicon. So we can sort of also talk about these as parts, but I think it makes more sense to call them powers. They're capabilities, they're things the hegemonicon does. And we've got four things here: presentation, or fantasia in the Greek, from where we get the word fantasy, of course. And fantasia, presentation, is like perception. We discussed that last week again with Aristotle, the receiving of impressions from outside. So that's one of the things that happens with the hegemonicon. It receives impressions, whether they be sound, vision, touch, etc. And of course, it on the basis of these impressions, that it's going to trigger some kind of action or movement. So impressions sort of lead to the next element, which is impulse. Impulse is the trigger for action and movement, often, as I said, in response to fantasia, in response to what's perceived, what sort of what the person is aware of, and that triggers impulse or action, which in Greek, in ancient Greek, is horme. Assent, which is strongly sort of linked to the capacity to reason, is the capacity to sort of assent, to agree or not to assent to what we are told. So it's about our power to sort of accept or not accept things that we hear. And this is important to the Stoics in terms of one of their guiding principles, that we should only be sort of we should only feel responsible for the things that are within our control, and things that are outside our control are of no concern to us. So assent is one of the ways that we sort of maintain that sort of division, that possibility. So if we're sort of presented with a proposition that something which doesn't concern us, that happened, is terrible and awful, we don't have to assent to that proposition, right? It's something that we just accept that it happened, but we don't assent to the value judgment. So assent is accepting or not accepting what we're told, which of course is very closely linked to the power of reason, the rational power of the soul. And the Stoics saw that idea of reason as kind of linked up with the world's soul. And this is where you see the kind of harmony in their view. It's what we would call a kind of pantheistic philosophy, in that it's like, there's a kind of world soul that pervades everything and is infused with a kind of rationality. And human reason is capable of kind of harmonizing with that world soul, of sort of recognizing it, of seeing it in practice and kind of harmonizing with it. So that's a kind of broader idea within the Stoics of this sort of combination of world soul and individual soul. That's an important sort of part of their view. All right, so in the discussion task for this week, I want you to think about and talk about one respect in which the Stoic view, which we've talked about in this lecture, one respect in which it resembles the view of Plato or Aristotle, and one respect in which it differs. So think about some of the comparisons. We've talked about the fragmented nature of the soul in Plato. We've talked about the relation of soul and body. We've talked about whether the soul is material, or sort of conceived as separable from the body, that it comes from elsewhere and comes inside, rather than being part of the material stuff of the body. So there's a number of things to focus on. So I want you to think about that and talk about one respect in which they differ, one respect in which it perhaps resembles Plato, Aristotle, and to talk about that in your discussion post this week.